Welcome, everybody. This is workshop number 5, sorry, running ahead. Today, Paul is joining us. He did a lot of work in the FIDEA project and as an independent consultant on fisheries, especially small-scale fisheries and fisheries data management. And today, he's going to share a bit of his insights, which is going to be a lot, I think. So we are looking forward to your presentation, Paul. Good to have you here.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Thank you so much, Shannon, and for all the other colleagues who are joining in from different parts of the world, mostly Africa. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to participate in this noble course, WIOGEN, which it's a very great platform to connect, network, but also to share ideas. I believe it has come a long way and we should embrace it and take it further, particularly a space for young and early career scientists to share their ideas and, I would say pitch some of the ideas and also get some feedback. So I will encourage us to take it further than even where it has come from. After saying that, I just want to share briefly from my experiences on working in the area of small-scale fisheries, largely working mostly in Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, and to some extent currently also doing some work in freshwater fisheries. So I've done some work in Lake Victoria and also currently doing some work in Lake Malawi, and hopefully soon probably doing some work in the Middle East. So I would say quite a diverse background, well, with some also experience from Latin America. But overall, I just want to share a few experiences. So it's not like, I have the solutions, but more or less I've put in several ideas that have gathered from different publications and also presentations that I've done that highlight the scale of small-scale fisheries in terms of their contribution to livelihoods, but also the challenges that they face and how we can, in a sense, support the process as we move along. So I'll start by just giving some general overview of the importance of small-scale fisheries. And I like these statistics that has been presented by IIED that is recent, that, small-scale fisheries in totality can contribute close to 600, supports close to 600 million people, both directly and indirectly, if you also include their dependents. So just with this introduction, you see that, in terms of contribution, so in terms of the overall contribution that fisheries has globally, economically, but also in terms of nutrition, it plays a major role. And a larger part of this, of course, is divided into aquaculture, which is gaining a lot of prominence since the past decades, but also capture fishery has continued to grow in other parts of the world. So it is estimated that closely, if you look at direct engagement in the fishery sector, both aquaculture and the capture fisheries, then we would estimate close to 177 million people who are employed directly, with of course close to 120 million in the capture and also 57 million in the aquaculture sector. But of course, these are statistics that might grow because we do not have data from all the countries and we do not have the most recent data, for example, in aquaculture and the likes. But one thing that is certain is that when we look at the importance that it has at the local level in terms of the auxiliary services that are derived from fisheries, then it is quite an important sector. And 90% of the overall capture fishery is basically concentrated on small-scale fisheries, which we are going to focus on. So these are fisheries that are largely found in tropical countries, to a large extent, in the tropical countries. So we have Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and they contribute close to 90% of the overall workforce, but also in terms of production. But unlike the contribution that small-scale fisheries has, so we see that almost 90% comes from tropical countries. But when we look at it in terms of now, where do we find the most sustainable fisheries, or where do we find fisheries that are well managed? We see that when we look at it in that context, then small-scale fisheries, which are largely found in tropical countries, perform very poorly. So this is a map that was generated from the RAMS legacy database, which puts together all the fishery statistics, particularly from those fisheries that have gone through formal stock assessment. And already, if you see the the zones that are marked in red, you'll see that these are areas that are largely found in the tropics or the global south. And if you look at Africa, for example, you see that almost close to the entire Africa. So let's concentrate on the Western Indian Ocean region. You find that we do not have stocks that are, that have been assessed fully, that we can say they are sustainable. So this is largely because we do not have formal stock assessments that have been conducted for these fisheries because of lack of data. So this is a major challenge, despite the overall contribution the small-scale fisheries, bring in terms of management, in terms of the resources that are allocated into research and into the assessment. We are still doing poorly in tropical countries. And again, this is another plot that is relatively old now. It was done by Costello in 2012. But again, what it highlights is that when we consider formal stock assessment being the basis of assessing whether stocks are sustainable or not, we see that areas that are closer to the tropics perform poorly when we use indicators that give us some relative indices of biomass. So if you look at the current biomass over the biomass that will give us the maximum sustainable yield as an index, then you see that almost all the countries that found in the tropics are performing very poorly. So if you look at the report that was presented by FAO, which is normally done every 2 years, that is SOFIA report, we see that the trend of fisheries globally has changed in the past 50 years or so. Initially, when we look at 1974, we find that we had a lot of stocks which we could consider to be maximally sustainably fished. And we also had a category of fish that was considered to be underfished. So basically, these are fish that we can still explore and exploit. And the quantity of fisheries globally that were considered overfished were quite low. But over time, the quantity of fish that are overfished has been increasing over the years. And of course, because of an increase in assessing of stocks in the temperate countries, we also see that stocks that are considered to be sustainably fished have also been increasing. However, this relies on data that is aggregated at the country level, which is then compiled by the FAO, that is the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, and compiled as a statistics that is then presented at the state of the fisheries. So the assumption is that the data that we generate from countries are accurate, and it is through this that we get this global picture. So you realize that as we've looked at the first two maps, we see that most of the countries that have stocks that have not been properly assessed lie in the tropical countries. And this picture gives us an indication of fisheries that have been assessed based on data that has been compiled at the country level. Now, if we consider all those fisheries that are not assessed properly, can we reliably say that they fall in either of the categories that is presented here? And that's why the issue of fisheries data plays a very important role. The accuracy of data that is being compiled to use, or that is being used to compile some of these metrics, it's important that we take a closer look at this and ask ourselves, why is this a major challenge and why is this important? Now, small-scale fisheries, as we say, are important, but when we now look at them and dissect them, we see that they're quite complex in nature. So they are multi-species, so you have several species being targeted with different gears. So this in itself makes it difficult to manage the fisheries, because it means you have to collect data on almost every level, both at the gear level, at the species level, and also at times at a habitat level. So this in itself makes small-scale fisheries quite complex, and the issue of collecting or aggregating data at every other level becomes a challenge for most countries. Again, we see that the issue of enforcement becomes a big issue. Why? Because in as much as countries might allocate, the resources to collect data, they also need resources to enforce regulations to ensure that practices that are sustainable are the ones that are being used in the fisheries. But then we see that there is a dilemma between what to invest, for example, in monitoring and compiling of data vis-a-vis what needs to be allocated for monitoring and enforcement. So there is a compromise that most countries will have to make. Should we invest more in data collection, which will give us an indication of the status, or should we invest more in enforcement that will help us to manage our resources, but without any threshold, knowing what exactly is our status? So now we find that, for example, a lot of countries are moving into the blue economy, and one of the sectors that is put at the forefront is fisheries. But unfortunately, most countries cannot be able to determine the status of the resources that they have in the EEZ. So then we find that we are moving into an area where we invest into blue economy fisheries and invest in that, but we are doing so blindly because we do not have an indication of the status of our stocks. And hence, data plays a very important role in providing this information that will then be used to invest further in the fisheries if this is one of the priorities that countries have. So being multi-species in nature, being a multi-gear in nature brings another dimension, but more importantly, the social aspect of fishery is rarely considered in fishery sectors, because fishery at the end of it is not about the fish itself, but it's rather managing the fishes or managing the people who depend on the fishery itself. So we can invest in data collection, we can invest in enforcement, but at the end of the day, sustainability in fisheries has to look at all the three cornerstones. So the ecological, the social, and the economic aspect, and not just the ecology as well. So as we think about fisheries data collection, most of the time we emphasize so much on the ecological aspect without giving due consideration on the social and the economic aspect of the fisheries. And this becomes a problem, particularly when we want to enforce regulations, because we tend to push only the ecological agenda without giving due consideration on the social implications that it will have, particularly on the fishers and on their dependents. Now, this is one example, just gives you a challenge on how difficult it is to manage a small-scale fisheries. So this is a study that I did in Kenya during my PhD, and it gives you just an indication that in such a small fisheries, small-scale fisheries, you have more than 50 or more than even 100 species that are being targeted. But only a few of those species contribute significantly to the overall catch. So what normally happens is that most countries and even most research institutions will only then focus on collecting data on only key indicator species, but not on the overall species that are caught in the fisheries. Now, this is largely because of an issue of investment. There is lack of resources to invest in terms of monitoring the entire fisheries. But overall, if we know that if we have to manage our fisheries sustainably, we must look at the entire ecosystem, meaning we need to consider all the species in relation to the ecosystem, but also look at the social aspect. So then this presents a challenge. What should we monitor in terms of fish? Should we monitor all the species? Do we have the money, the time, and the capacity to manage all the fisheries and collect the data? Or should we only target a few of the key indicator species? Again, looking at the issue dimension of gear, as I mentioned, multi-gear, different gears target different components of the fisheries. So you'll find, for example, different gears that only target small fish, others will target the larger fish. But in the end, when we enforce, for example, regulations, let's say on size indicators, how do we manage the fisheries based on size if specific gears only target a subset of the population and others also, capture only a subset of the other population? So these are some of the complexity that make monitoring of small-scale fisheries a challenge, particularly when it comes to the data collection part. So you see that all these species, they grow differently. They have different biological characteristics. They grow to different sizes. So while, for example, the sardines and the pelagic fisheries might only grow to a few centimeters size, it might be probable to target them, let's say, using a cast net, which has a small mesh size. But at the same time, you end up targeting a grouper, which is a juvenile. So as you collect data, you realize that these complexities are going to come into place. And in the end, when you have to make a decision, the question is, how do you make decisions based on the data that you have collected, ensuring that all the elements of the ecosystem have been, in a sense, been preserved or are sustainably being fished? So this is a challenge both for management, but also for data collection. What should we collect? Should we collect all species? Should we collect a subset of the species? Should we target all the gears or only a subset of the gears? Now, in the end, what happens is that we find that small-scale fisheries are often confronted with the issue of data limitation, whereby it's not that we do not have data. We might have data, but the data is not sufficient for us to be able to do a full stock assessment that will give us the true picture of the fishery. So data limitation is a common characteristic of most small-scale fisheries. Why? Because either we have few data or we have poor quality data, which has been collected only maybe a subset, or we may have data that has been collected but has not been processed and therefore cannot be used for any meaningful decision. Or we have data, but we cannot use it for full stock assessment because we do not have the biological aspects of the species. So there are several other indicators that we can use to look at how poor or how rich a fishery is, But this graphic, for example, what it tells you is that here is an example of a data collection system in a country where you find that in 2017, maybe because of lack of resources, they did not collect data, in January until October, November. So they only collected data, let's say, in December. The next year, they collected data, but you can see, based on the number of individuals targeted, maybe the sampling was not done in a proper way. So you end up as a scientist or a manager with this kind of data, and you're supposed to use this to make what? Informed decision. It becomes a big challenge because either you will discard the data and not use it, or you will analyze it, but then you will you will not give the true picture of the fisheries because the sampling regime was not properly done. And therefore, it becomes very difficult to create or to have a suitable sampling regime that captures the entire fishery, that can also give you a true picture of what is being targeted. So this is just an example of some of the challenges that most countries will be facing. Lack of data, or in terms of lack of proper sample that will be robust enough to be able to conduct a full assessment. So in the end, it is advisable that when we think about fisheries data, we need to have this pathway. So there is more like a pathway that we can follow that can help us to develop a system that we can use to, in a sense, collect data that can be robust enough, but can also be meaningful and help in the decision making. A large part of this is on the why. Why do we have to collect the fisheries data in the first place? Without that question being answered, we will collect data and then try to use the data to answer a question which it was not intended for. And that is normally the case in most fisheries, where you find that, oh yes, we have some data, but you ask, why was the data collected? It was a project. What was the aim of the project? Maybe food security. Now, it forces you now to use data that was meant for food security, and now you want to turn it and use it for stock assessment. What's going to happen is basically you're going to create misinformation because that data was not originally intended for that purpose. So the why of the data is very important. Why do we collect the data? And then how or who should be responsible for that collection? Is it the research? Is it the managers? So these are questions that we need to ask ourselves before we engage in any meaningful data collection. How is the data going to be processed? How is it going to be managed? You see a lot of projects starting without asking these questions. So people decide, oh, let's go to the field. We're going to collect that. Why are we going to collect the data? No, we'll answer the question once we have the data, So, but these are questions that have to be asked critically before we even go out to the field. Why do we need the data? Oh, because we want to answer a certain policy question. Who is going to collect the data? The research and the managers. How are we going to process it? We are going to use stock assessment models, which are going to give us some indicators that we can use to make decisions. How is this result going to be? How are they going to be disseminated? Through policy briefs, through publications? And how are we going to appraise whether the system has worked or not? So a lot of people will not want to go this process because it is a question that asks you to dig deep into your conscience and ask yourself all these questions before you enjoy your DSA to go to the field and collect the data. So if we have to do things right, then we have to ask ourselves these questions. And the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries helps us to answer this question: why do we collect fisheries data? In order to ensure a sustainable management of fisheries and to enable social, economic objectives to be achieved, sufficient knowledge of social, economic, and institutional factors to be developed through data gathering, analysis, and research. So it tries to help us understand why, how, and how are we going to use the information in the end. All of us will want to have a sustainable fisheries. And for us to do that, then we have to consider all the elements of the fisheries, social, ecological, and economic. But also we need to involve stakeholders at all the institutions involved and be able to agree on how that is going to be done, how it's going to be analyzed, and how is it going to be disseminated. But unfortunately, we see that this does not happen. So when we look at this in more detail, we ask ourselves, fisheries data can be used in many ways, but I'm just going to give three for the purpose of this presentation. One could be for policy formulation. We want to, let's say, enforce a closed season. For that, we need some evidence that maybe fish spawn at this particular time, at this particular place. That will inform us to know what kind of data do we need to collect and when do we need to collect and how do we need to process that. to formulate management plans. Every fishery needs to have a proper and scientifically designed management plan that can help the managers to manage that fisheries in a sustainable way, but also to determine management actions to implement policy plans. So if you want to implement certain or we want to enforce certain regulations, then what guides us are the evidences that have been got from the data that we have collected. So there are so many other reasons why we collect fisheries data, but I just gave this because it kind of creates a boundary of the main or the core things that actually inform fisheries data collection. So when you look at this example, for example, it is tells you, okay, why? So in this case, for sustainable management of fisheries, or it can also contribute to food security, or it can also help us to meet internationally data commitments. So these are the questions of why. Why do we need to collect? And when we ask these questions, each and every answer will have a different need in terms of data collection. So for example, to meet the needs of the SDG 14.41, which is an indicator of stock status, we know that we will have to do stock assessment. If we want to see the contribution of fisheries to the GDP, we know we'll have to look at the economic data of the fisheries as well. So the why is a very important question in fisheries data management and in fisheries data collection, but rarely do we ask that question. We ask it at the end when we already have the data and try to force the data to try and answer the why at the end. So again, this is an example of how simple evidence can be got from simple. So this is an example of a length frequency data from maybe one species. And with this data, we ask ourselves, okay, let's say we want to enforce a size restriction and we have length frequency data. We can determine from the data the size at maturity and then see what percentage of fish that has been caught are mature, immature, or are still growing. And as a manager or a scientist, when you see visually this graphic, it will tell you that in this case, for example, a larger proportion of individuals that are being caught are still immature. There is a percentage that is mature, of course, but it is a concern that our fishery is dominated by immature individuals. So a manager, this will prompt you to design appropriate data collection systems that will help you to monitor this over time and also come up with a policy that can help manage the fisheries and reduce the number of immature individuals in the catch. So that will be done by asking the why. Once we see the evidence, then it helps us to design a proper data collection regime that can help us answer those specific questions. So when we want to look at the sustainability of the fisheries, again, we ask, what is the size of the population? And then we look at the biological aspect of the fisheries. So we not only collect catch and effort, which will give us an indication of how many people are in the fishery, how much are they taking, but now we are interested to see, we are looking at the sustainability of the fisheries. We need to look at the biology of the species. This will then help us to design a data collection system that not only focuses on catch and effort, but also looks at the biological aspect of the fishery. So probably we need to collect gonads, we need to look at the sizes, and this will help us then to answer the issue of sustainability in terms of, are we fishing sustainably or not? So when we look at all this, we realize that, for example, in any fishery, we can get catch data, we can get abundance data and biological data. And when we run our models, it can tell us stock status, it can give us predictions that can help us to manage our fisheries in the future, but it can also help us to make management decisions at this current moment, either precautionary or based on certain evidences that we have found. So this just gives us an indication of how the data comes in to help us make the decisions that we need to do as managers or as researchers. But then we have seen that there are many other issues that we need to look at, particularly in small-scale fisheries. And one of the issues that I've seen a lot is the lack of capacity, the technical capacity. So yes, we might have the money to collect the data, but we lack the expertise on how to do it. And I must say that there has been quite a tremendous growth in terms of scientists who have been trained in the region, in the Western Eurasian region. So I would say that the lack of capacity is an issue that we should not be discussing anymore. We have a lot of capacity in the region now. This used to be something, maybe I would say 10, 15 years, maybe this was an issue. But now we have a lot of young and upcoming scientists who have been trained and who are capable to do all these things. So the capacity is a non-issue at the moment. I would say it's waning off. But then still there are certain specific skills which the new generation of scientists might not necessarily possess. So for example, the species identification is an art that most of the old technicians have, but most of the young scientists do not have. So you end up having a lot of data that has been aggregated together. So you just see, oh, rabbit fish, but you don't know which species. Or you have snappers, but you don't know which species because there is a problem of species identification. So the lack of capacity here is not necessarily in the absence of the skills, basically the knowledge, but actually in the absence of specific skills which are key in helping us to collect data at the right scale and in the right resolution. Then the issue of processing the data. Yes, you might collect the data, you might identify to the species level, but how do we process the data so that we can be able to disseminate and also make informed decision? So here again, we see that there's a lot of challenge. One, I've realized, for example, most of the fisheries institutions will take new scientists who come from diverse backgrounds. So ecology, maybe archaeology. So their background may not necessarily be in fisheries, but yet they are given the responsibility to manage and perhaps even be involved in fisheries assessment. So there is need to have continuous training within every institutions on key skills like data collection, data analysis, particularly when we focus on the fisheries aspects. So this is when we talk about the challenges of data collection, when we look at the technical aspects. Again, we see that because of the lack of capacity in the technical aspects, we see that there's a lot of data gaps. So you might find a huge database with data, but there are a lot of data gaps. One, because the questions were not properly asked, so we have a lot of data gaps. So there was either undersampling or there's oversampling. There's probably errors in stratification where we have a lot of landing sites, but we have avoided to stratify our collection system. So we do not have a robust enough sampling, experimental design. We do not design our experiments, or we do not have the infrastructure to collect all that information. So we don't have the computers. We do not have maybe digital data collection systems, which will give us, data in real time. And then, of course, lack of appropriate data collection systems and information systems. So like I said, mobile phones or tablets. So this can enhance our data collection and can also speed up the process. But unfortunately, most institutions or countries may not have the money to invest in this infrastructure. Then you find that this challenge of organization and governance becomes an issue where you have so many institutions. So you have the Ministry of Fisheries, you have the Fisheries Research Institution, you have the university, you have the NGOs. All of them are collecting data on different issues, on different scales. And there is always lack of communication and sharing of ideas to know what do we really need to collect. So there's a lot of overlap. There's a lot of data being collected by different people, different designs. And in the end, you cannot put all this data together because when you try, you realize that there are a lot of, while there are overlaps, there are a lot of differences in terms of how the experiments were designed or what the project wanted to do is different from what the fisheries want to answer. So this becomes a challenge, particularly for small-scale fisheries in our countries, because every institution will do their own thing without consulting. Hence, we find so much data that cannot be used and it's only discarded. And so it becomes a waste of money. Then the countries do not invest fully in data collection, in fisheries data collection. So countries will expect to have decisions made, will expect to have policies made, but they don't want to invest in the actual data collection. So for example, this is just an example of one of the countries where you find that in a whole ministry, you only have one staff who is well equipped to handle technical aspects of fisheries. And you only have 4 or so IT people who are working on the fisheries sector. So there is no support in terms of investment of staff and also in tools to help the fisheries officers, researchers do their work in a proper way. But of course, this is an issue that I think we've discussed a lot in the past. And what often this leads to is that countries or institutions will try to use the limited resources they have to collect data, but in the end, they end up having data that does not give us the true picture. And this can also lead to misinformation, particularly when we have to make decisions on data or based on data that is not reliable or data that is not complete. So often you'll find that probably the minister will call and say, oh, I need this information. We need to make a decision on the blue economy. and you only have data for, let's say, 6 months, which was not collected properly, and you use that as a basis and say, oh, our stocks are overexploited, that can lead to a misinformation. And it's important for us to really be critical in asking ourselves, the data that we have, the fisheries data that we have, is it reliable and robust enough to make the decisions that we want to make? And of course, this will then affect the policies that we also make, because a lot of times we complain that we do not have new policies that address the challenges that we have in fisheries. It's just because we do not invest in the proper data collection methods that will give us the evidences that we need for decision making. So what happens most cases that you have data that has not been properly designed, the questions have not been asked, but in the end, we still try to force the methods and the tools to try and come up with solutions. So this is an example, for example, of an octopus fishery where that has been collected, but the method that is being used to analyze this data is not the right model for this species. But in the end, the results will come out, this species is doing well. But then you have used the wrong model on the wrong data to answer the right question. So I like this statement by Ray Hilborn, who says that if you attempt, for example, to use the length frequency data to formulate management advice for this species, octopus fishery, then you will be misguided and fundamentally hopeless. So yes, you have the data, but you are using a different model to try and answer a different question and use that information to make the decisions. So in the end, it is fundamentally misguided and hopeless. And that's why I still insist the why question is very important when we're talking about the fisheries. Why do we need to collect the data? That will help us a lot. And then we ask, how are we going to process that data? Because then once we understand the why and the how, then we will not be trying to force the data to answer the question, but rather we will have the evidence that we already need to answer the questions that we have. Again, you see a case where there is deficient data. That has been collected, but only for a subset of the population. There is data that is missing for the young, population. But then you will see this in a lot of the reports and a lot of the publications, and they'll say, oh, the species is overexploited. But then when you look at the quality of data and the way the data has been collected, it is not sufficient. It is not right to make such an informed decision. But again, this is something that at the end, we try to force the data to answer our questions without having asked the questions previously as we should have. So in the end, we see that there are a lot of other challenges that I will have talked about when you're talking about fisheries data, but because of time, and also to give you some time to feedback, these are some of the issues that for me stand out. And I will say that it's important that when we ask the questions of fisheries data, we should ask how the data is going, what the data is going to answer, how is it going to be collected, how will it be used, and the methods that we are going to use, are they cost effective? Are they sustainable? This will help us to design systems or sampling regimes that are realistic, that are within our budgets, but can still answer the pertinent questions that we need to answer in regard to fishery sustainability. Because in the end, the target is to have a sustainable fisheries. So we can still go for a more cost-effective approach that uses the limited resources and the capacities that we have, but will be able to answer the questions that we need to answer. So the advice here is start simple, add complexity as you go, but in the end, focus on a long-term strategy that will help to manage the fishery sustainably. In the end, there is no magic. Garbage in, garbage out. It remains to be true. So thank you so much. And if there's any question, I'm happy to respond.